Well, someone better say something then. Stefan, why don't you give a little intro to what we're doing here?
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you listen to us. This is the third webinar of the Xscale Alliance. Today we will be talking about Beyond BDD. And today we have on air Peter Merrill and John Smart.
And John needs a link in, because I'm about to go and get him one.
Okay, good.
So let's see if I can find it. That must be it there. Hang on. Why don't you keep talking while I find the damn thing and give it to John?
He's looking. Okay, just a second. So he's...
We will have to edit this part out.
Yeah, certainly.
Here we go. There it is. That's the...
So I sent him the link. He was asking why
good.
The Slack group, so he should be joining us any second.
Good. That's very exciting. All right. Well, let me talk about what we are doing today a little bit. And I've got a brief slide deck. I'm hoping to rattle through this in about 10, 15 minutes. And then maybe we can have a chat, the three of us, about what the heck's in here. This is reasonably advanced stuff. Okay, this is very advanced stuff. So we're going to start by talking about what BDD is, but then we're going to get into the wild and woolly stuff. I guess what I'm saying to the listeners is don't fret too much if you feel like this is a little bit beyond. It is a bit beyond. That's sort of the definition of B2D2 is beyond BDD. Stefan, can you see the shared slides at the moment?
Yes, looks beautiful.
Okay, then let's see if I get into this. Okie dokie. So I have to immediately apologize for stealing a graphic. I will send out links to the gentleman that I borrowed this from. I have used this on a post on LinkedIn before and did send him a notification and he didn't respond. So I'm assuming it's okay with him. But anyway, we'll see how we go. It's a very pretty little robot and I'm going to use it throughout. So what is BDD good for? I'm pretty certain that John Smart... Is John on the call yet?
John joined the call. Morning, John.
Well, we'll wait for him to find his mic. I'm pretty certain John will disagree with me with this being the fundamental purpose of BDD. But the basic goal, as I see it, is we want to move quality to the left. We want to be able to get our acceptance criteria formally described, and we want to be able to automate checking them. And we want to do that at the level of a system interface, not just down in the guts. We want to know that the system is doing what the business stakeholders and design stakeholders think it should be doing, not just what the technical stakeholders think it should be doing. So obviously it costs a lot more to discover problems in acceptance criteria and whether the system agrees with them later on than it does to find them once they're in production. But in practical terms, BDD is good for a lot more than just this lovely idea of moving quality to the left. Yes, there's enormous benefits to cost of quality in moving it to the left. But one of the most fundamentals, and this is something that John says a lot about in his books, we want to get the programmers, testers, and BAs to work together to define acceptance criteria, rather than having them thrown over the wall or discovered later in testing. BDD gives us a lingua franca for getting these guys to talk together formally about what the system interface should be doing, how it should be behaving. Behavior-driven development, after all. Well, that's still a bit geeky. We want to look at this in terms that go beyond the geeky. But there's another geeky claim to fame. When we first introduced BDD in CBA, we ran some studies to see how much this affected cost of quality. And we discovered that over the course of a 3-month release, on average, we would reuse a test step implementation 20 times over the course of the release, effectively bringing the total cost of ownership for the quality automation down by a factor of 20. So where in the bank we could not get TDD to produce sustainable benefits to quality, what was happening was we would build TDD suites, and then there would be release and instability in the environments that we were working in, because this is a bank with an awful lot of layers and not enough, at the time, we're talking 2011, 12, not enough service virtualization. When there was instability, we would have to comment out the tests to be able to get a build, and then they would stay commented out until they got close to the release point, and then time pressure would prevent us bringing them back in, and then they'd be stale and useless. So bringing down the maintenance cost of the quality automation was enormously valuable to us.
I've got a thing to Pete. I'll just chip in there.
Yes, please do, John. Welcome, by the way.
Yes, thank you. That reminds me of a story that I had in a very large client a while back, where we had to automate. Basically, it was mission impossible. We had almost 1,000 manual tests to automate in the space of about 6 weeks. We had a little bit of time for that to prepare. And when you're talking about reusable steps, that really rings a bell, because we brought it down to about 450 automated tests. But those automated tests actually only use 50 core steps. Not given when then. So Gherkin scenarios and the actual test scenarios were a little bit more varied. But the actual core business steps, we were reusing 50 core steps that were extremely stable, and that's how we were able to scale that. So I think it is a really good point. We were doing that with
critically important.
But the engineering side is obviously really important there. You really need to get the engineering down to pat. That's what we're using, things like screenplay and solid engineering principles. It wasn't just record replay style testing. I think that's really important as well.
That was my experience every time I've applied BDD. It's when you are working with large businesses, when you're working with a lot of legacy, the ability to use reusable steps across your scenarios it's just a huge benefit. But this third point, mission command. So this is the idea that instead of command and control, we want to give our feature teams, our feature scrums, our feature squads, whatever you want to call these things, we want to give them one feature at a time to deliver. One team gets one feature, and then we want to give the acceptance criteria. In terms of chopping the feature into stories, well, then they can do that for just one feature. And the benefit of doing it this way is that then you don't have to intersperse stories from multiple features in a backlog. And that means you can bring each feature to market much faster, increasing your ROI. And this might seem a little bit heretical from a Scrum point of view, but it works. And in future podcasts, we will look at more detail about how we go about that kind of breadth-first approach. But this mission command idea means that we don't need to worry very much about getting a ridiculously detailed product increment plan in place. We simply,
Question from my side. Why would you think this to be a heretical thought as far as Scrum is concerned? I mean, to my experience, Scrum is perfectly suited to really build stuff no one wants.
So can I have a go at answering that?
Let me answer first.
John here. I want to chip in too. This is interesting.
All right, go for it, John.
What I find, and one of the nice things I found that we've sort of structured with Xscale is the hierarchy where you don't go features, stories, then scenarios. You go features, scenarios, and then stories. So basically how you understand what you're supposed to deliver in a feature. That's where things like feature mapping are really useful, where you can come up with a whole lot of scenarios that describe a feature without being worried about how long it takes to implement. And what the outcome, you think about what the outcomes of each scenario are supposed to be, and then you look at the outcome and say, okay, that outcome, we'd like to make a story out of it. And so you go features, scenarios, stories, as opposed to breaking things down into stories individually. The problem that I've found with stories is people tend to do a rubbish job of chopping them up a lot of the time. So you get stories of all sorts of real. I mean, recently I saw a story which was, as a developer, I want to migrate this control to Angular 4.
Yeah.
And there wasn't a so that because... And so I think when you get that constraint that you have to do a story in a small chunk, it's supposed to have theoretical business value, it adds quite a lot to it's very, very granular, whereas features are all about delivering business value. You're not so fast on how long it takes to build.
Yeah, just to give a concrete example, if we had a feature role-based access control, we could chop it up into stories like the user can log in, it's possible to create new users, we can authorize different users to do different things and so on. But usually the amount of value delivered for those little stories is not sufficient for us to do a release. And the idea with features is they are the atom of release planning. So the intent here is to not chop the features into stories until we absolutely have to. And that way we observe the original XP value of Yagni. You aren't going to need it. And the reason this is heretical is, well, gee, that means we don't have any backlogs, at least not product backlogs of stories. And Scrum really likes product backlogs of stories, Stefan.
Yeah, but we also know the cargo cult version of the Scrum product backlog, right? So the repository of ideas, and we could think about this in the future and clutter up everything. I mean, join any project or of a larger scale at a larger organization, and you find Jira backlogs that have 500 to 1,000.
Tell me about it. Yep. Okay. So look, I want to move on because we've got a reasonable amount to cover in half an hour. Anyway, the intent here is that being able to attach the acceptance criteria, the scenarios to the features, as John was talking about, means that we can then hand that one feature plus its acceptance criteria off to a squad and say, right, exactly how you chop this up, exactly how you decide to deliver it, that's your business. We're just giving you a mission. You achieve the mission, then come back and get another one. The lovely thing there too is that we can use this when we're doing distributed agile. If we are dealing with ticky-tacky stories, then that's kind of hard to do. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on outside-in red-green refactor. I think that when it comes to the details of BDD, John's books are so superb that I'd be very silly to try and explain them now. I want to go beyond BDD. I want to look at what BDD doesn't do. And I promise, John, I'm going to get through this quick enough that we can then have an adequate amount of time to discuss after. Is that okay with you? You still there?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, so BDD is example-based. Now, yes, there may be some ways to translate those examples into a form you could run against production systems, but that's a lot of work to do that translation. Out of the box, we don't automate quality against production systems. We automate quality in virtual environments or canned data environments that we can run against in continuous integration service. Would you agree with that, John?
I would, but I've got some, I think we'll talk about how we could extend that idea later on, which goes in the direction of what you're saying. But yes, the idea of the core concept of BDD is that we use examples to explore a concept, to explore a set of requirements. And the examples explain and illustrate the business rules that we're trying to understand. And if you start with just business rules, you run into ambiguities and incorrect assumptions and things that you didn't know about. Whereas if you start to use the examples to drill down into those business rules, then you get a lot more breadth. And so that's really what we're talking about when we say that BDD is example-based.
Yes, the way I look at it, in science we have theorems and we have counterexamples that disprove the theorems. And so those counterexamples, whether they call them examples or counterexamples, they're basically ways of getting little bits of data that tell us, for example, that the system is broken or the system is not doing what our theories say that the system should do. Now, we're going to look in just a moment at what we could do to represent the theorems themselves, but we'll come back to that idea. I want to talk about this one very briefly because we've got some visuals later on. BDD doesn't have a way to chain short tests together to generate long tests, or for that matter, to generate tests. All the tests are carefully written down. So this becomes important when we're trying to deal with the deep quality of systems, where we need long tests that are probably beyond the abilities of humans to think up. Now, John Hughes in Functional Programming Land has gone into great detail on why this is important, and we'll look at a couple of his visuals later on. Not very much later on, because we don't have an awful lot of time. So then the third thing that it doesn't do is BDD, we are talking to product managers, we are talking to business stakeholders, all about what the system should be doing. But when it comes to what we write down and what we automate against, we don't generate analytics that they could use to discover whether the system in production is behaving in some fashion that would cause them to make decisions about prioritizing different features, about understanding what's causing particular kinds of bottlenecks in the quantitative analytics. By quantitative, I mean the stuff that we get out of Google Analytics and Facebook Analytics and so on. That stuff is all about, our retention rate is such and such, our activation rate is such and such, we're getting this many referrals and so on. The quantitative analytics don't tell us the reasons why we're not retaining people, why we're not getting referrals, and so on. So if we could somehow get a set of qualitative analytics, a large field of them, and if we could look at them over time, we could understand the system behavior in a huge amount of detail. Well, we've got all of this instrumentation of system behavior in BDD, but it doesn't give us an ability to generate a field of qualitative analytics. So the obvious question with this stuff is, how can we go about solving those problems? What can we do about that? So I'm going to give a little nutshell on each of these, and then I'm going to throw the floor open. So basically in Functional Programming Land, in John Hughes land, John Hughes is the author of a wonderful tool called QuickCheck that has spawned a huge range of tools. They're all about something called property-based testing. And this is kind of like the theorem end of science. We describe the invariant aspects of the behavior of a system, and then we can generate huge numbers of examples that should meet those invariants. And the nice thing in Functional Programming Land is that we have a very easy time of generating those for reasons that I'm not going to go into here about functional programming. But anyway, the neat thing with this stuff is we can discover problems in system behavior that are far deeper than any human tester would ever be able to discover with an intentionally written test. That's not to say we don't want the counterexample-based tests. We do, because they don't expose, the property-based testing, the theorem-based testing, doesn't expose the kinds of problems that we find with the example-based testing, and vice versa. So in terms of what this looks like, we basically have a network of tests, and whether we run one step or another partly depends on what we've been able to discover so far. If we've discovered that the tests up to this point are failing, fantastic. Now we can simplify the generated tests until we have a nice little counterexample. And there's an automated way to do that. But if we haven't, if everything is still moving along, fantastic. Let's generate some more test alternatives and see if we can discover a problem. And this is beautiful because it generates combinatorially explosive coverage of the space of system behaviors. Now, we can talk about that in more detail later on, but on generating long tests. So in functional testing land, functional programming land, there's a beautiful paradigm called functional reactive programming. It's often used in in video games and GUIs and things where the statefulness of the system is a critical input to the decisions that you make. So the beautiful thing about functional reactive programming is it actually has objects that are behaviors and objects that are events. And we can program with these things in a first order way. There's nothing in the underpinnings of BDD, in Cucumber, SpecFlow, all of these sorts of tools, Serenity included, that gives us these first order representations of events and behaviors. And being able to program with these things means that we're able to composite our tests in a way that we don't do with BDD. You might immediately be terribly frightened if you're a programmer. Oh, we're going to lose any coherence to our tests. If I run one test and then another test after it, I don't know that the first test's side effects didn't kill the relevance, the validity of the second test, and so on. So chaining these things together is nutty from a programmer's point of view. But in this functional reactive programming, we have a way to be very explicit about causality and the timeliness of different events that allows us to code around that in a consistent way, in a very economical way. So it's really beautiful. We just don't have it in BDD because BDD is something that's begun in imperative programming land. Finally, oh, hang on, before finally, I mentioned I was going to talk about John Hughes. This is why that's important. This is Hughes' graph of the probability of a test failure versus the length of a generated test case. And as you can see, the probability is increasing linearly with the length of the test, and that's because the range of different behaviors, of different combinations of test steps that could cause a problem grows. The range of it, not the test steps themselves, but the range of different problems grows exponentially with the length of the tests. So this is an incredibly powerful result. And the fact that we don't leverage this when it comes to ATDD and BDD is a big problem. This is Hughes' visualization. Imagine that there are these 5 failing test steps. Well, it doesn't really matter how long the test is. As long as I get these 5 steps in this order, I'll generate a failure. So if I can generate long tests, it gives me far greater chance of discovering these things. Now, finally, on qualitative analytics. So if we can take each of our BDD tests, which after all, each of them sucks data out of a service layer or out of a database, and if we can correlate them and their intention, because our BDD tests are named intentionally, if we can correlate them, their movements of those things over time with the movements of our pirate metrics, our acquisition, activation, retention, referral, and return metrics, if we can correlate the stuff from Google Analytics and Facebook Analytics and so on, if we can correlate the movements of this incredibly complex field of qualitative analytics, of the probes that we've put in to do BDD, if we can correlate that with the movements of the quantitative analytics, well, then we would have an ability to do scientific product management in a way we can't do at the moment. And the beautiful thing is we are living in the 21st century where we have AutoML, we have TensorFlow, we have tools that will take extremely complicated, extremely highly dimensional fields of data and classify them and correlate them, find the clustering in there and find the correlations with the movements of particular simple indices like the quantitative analytics. Right now, we don't have any tools to do any of these 3 things. What I'm talking about with all of this page is all aspirational, but there's no reason we can't do these things. We have the tools to build this stuff. We just haven't thought about doing it yet. And so that's why we have this B2D2 guy. So the XScale pitch where we combine a whole bunch of different disciplines, this falls solidly into a product management discipline. You might think of it as a side DevOps approach, and it does indeed work in that context. But that's the beauty of making transitions in PowerPoint. It doesn't really want to. That's okay. What I'm going to do with this is I'm going to give a different screen share. I can poke around. But John, would you like to talk a little bit, or John and Stefan, talk a little bit about what you've just managed to squirt out in the last 20 minutes?
One thing for John here, one thing that I found quite interesting is what you're saying about the idea of reusing different parts, different actions or behaviors that we haven't got that as a first concept in BDD. There's one thing that we do with the tests and the test automation we've been doing with Serenity and Java and JavaScript that's just under the hood of the given lens. And when we use the screenplay pattern, in screenplay, the basic concept is that if you're designing a test, the traditional approach is to use something like page objects or an interface to describe a web service. So you're modeling the interface with the application, but that's actually wrong, because what we should be modeling is, like you're saying, the behavior of the users. And in screenplay, behavior is actually a first-class concept. So we model things like onboard a user, create an account, add an object to a shopping cart, purchase onboard or purchase an insurance policy, and so forth. And those bricks, we haven't got any, obviously we haven't done this at the minute, but those bricks, those reusable behaviors sound like they'd be very good candidates for this sort of combinatorial playground.
I completely agree with you. The neat thing here is we can talk about the behaviors both of the users and of the system and do the correlation there as well. So in production, we can actually have decision-making about the behaviors of the system based on different segmentations of user behaviors, particularly multiple users. It gets very exciting, actually. Stefan, how about you?
Well, currently I'm struggling to suggest BDD as an approach to my current team. John and I share a small history on that, but I'm looking for it. So from my perspective, it would be a great advantage to my organization at the moment if we just manage to get better at risk mitigation, you know. I mean, a lot of people believe that test automation is also already the nirvana of engineering. I believe the real thing starts, and I take along with John here, the moment you can create a common mindset of business and engineering how to do this. And this really starts on the left side of the equation, not on the right side.
Yeah, that's where we were with the original visual here.
Exactly.
If we think about what we can enable teams, delivery teams to do with automated testing, we can enable them to do refactoring. It's a really important part of what you get out of the quality automation. You can reduce the technical debt that you have to pay interest on, and this is an enormously valuable thing for any organization to be able to pay down its technical debt before it goes exponential, which it does otherwise. The cost of change curve goes through the roof. But, and that's what we're seeing in these things, but if we think about the beyond BDD stuff, the B2D2 stuff, that would enable us to refactor the business, the structure of the market ecosystem and the organization's ecosystem. We would be able to use these things to simplify what's going on in our go-to-market and in our design. So the power of the ability to correlate quantitative and qualitative analytics will go even beyond what we're thinking of as reducing the technical debt and the risk that the organization is carrying, and all the way into reducing the organizational debt and systematically opening market bottlenecks. So in terms of prioritizing features that will make the go-to-market better.
But wouldn't Beyond BDD first require an organization to fully embrace BDD itself?
Well, I don't know about first. It certainly would be a very good idea for them to do so first, because you get enormous benefit on the delivery end just from adopting BDD. Beyond BDD is going more into how can we get enormous benefit in the product management space, and using the same collateral, the same test infrastructure, the same processes, the three amigos, and so on. And that's That's why.
Now, I am seeing people use is describing in production systems. And I'm with some of my clients at the moment to describe business rules that we want to apply in the large data context. So where they've got a gazillion transactions or financial positions, they want to check for consistency because they're migrating it between systems. And they'll say things like, given a valid legal entity and a valid country, then some flag should be set in a particular field. So it's quite technical. These particular tests are quite technical, but the idea is that you can either do a combinatorial check and check everything, or you can randomly generate one and check a different one each time. Mm-hmm. I've also seen similar things that people are doing in productions. I heard a story of the Guardian newspaper, who, for their production system, they don't use production monitoring in the classic sense, but they actually go through and post news stories. So they basically post fake news, but except that no one can see it, unlike the Fox version. And
nice.
Each day, play nice, yes. So
you never know your words could be in Donald Trump's ear tomorrow.
I know. And I'm going over there in a couple of days, so I should be careful. So,
do go on.
Anyway, so they run these tests. They will basically produce random articles. So they don't do a polynomial combinatorial variation series of tests each time, but each time they'll run a different random article, and they'll run thousands of these articles each day. So much that they actually use statistical analysis to see whether anything fails, because one random failure might just be a WebDriver playing up. But 4 or 5 random failures on the same test, that's starting to look dodgy. And the value of that is that they're actually testing core business functionality as opposed to testing is the web service up.
Yes, and that's very much the idea here. We don't want our BDD tests to be describing things that a programmer would ordinarily test. We want them to describe the relationships between the behavior of the universe and the behavior inside the system interface, at the system interface. So the behavior of the users and the behavior of the system as it responds to them. The lovely thing about this approach is this will give us an ability to leverage the knowledge that we are able to mine from that stuff through data science. Basically, we have a whole bunch of people, data scientists, attached to most modern delivery programs, but they have to build all of their own rigs in terms of trying to figure out, okay, what's going on. They're very impoverished in terms of understanding system behaviors. And here, we'd bring them together with the people who are operating the systems and with the people who are developing new features. Hence, SciDevOps. And so far as I know, there aren't any tools out there that do this yet. So it's kind of an exciting time of the Agile ecosystem in general to be alive. Now, Stefan, I have a feeling that we better take some questions from the audience before we lose.
Yeah, that was my thought too. We have already delivered 30 minutes. So, to our audience, any questions from your side? Would you like to join the round talking-wise, so I can provide you with speaking opportunities? Gideon? Balaji? Anything from your side?
Yes, I'm here. No, it's all about me at the moment. I understand it BDD, but then this is getting more
interesting. It is indeed a step beyond. And that's why I was trying to say at the start of this, don't worry if it's feeling a little bit wild and woolly. It is wild and woolly. We're looking at where do we need to go next?
Yes, so it's something that's in the future that will be created.
Well, we need to start working on this stuff now if it's ever going to be in the future. And this gets us into some of the things we'll be doing with Hackathon Without Thrones. But I think that might be a subject for a different webinar. Any other questions at the moment?
So if there are no further questions, John, thanks a lot for joining us this morning.
It was a pleasure.
When we started out to do this Xscale podcast, one of the things I had to think about was, do we want to just talk about the same old agile stuff that everybody else in the world talks about? I think we've just demonstrated that we don't. What we're trying to do is inspire people to get involved in taking this further. That's where we began, as opposed to the training hierarchies that dominate agile today. We're trying to build a learning ecosystem. And if we can't challenge ourselves in our thinking, well, we're not going to learn much. So I guess what I'm saying is, I'm not surprised we don't have too many questions. I think this is hard to think about, but we have to challenge ourselves to think about the hard stuff if we're going to be able to get to the next agile breakthrough.
I think one interesting thing about these concepts is that there's quite a lot to take in when you take it all as a group, all this functional, reactive, qualitative, long-generating production, property-based testing. It's quite a mouthful.
Long words too.
Yes, but if you take it one by one, if you say, right, well, we're going to do BDD, we're going to express out the behaviors of our users, and then we're going to model the behaviors in terms of behavior actions and not page objects or clunky things like that. And then we say, well, what if we were to say, what if we were to take our examples and generalize them so that we could have, rather than saying, given I've insured my company for travel expenses in the United States, what if we were to allow something a little bit more general, given I have a valid travel policy for North America or valid travel policy, and I raise a claim in the designated travel period, then I should be able to process my claim. That's a very simple scenario, which would probably, but there aren't any concrete examples. That's a step towards making something generic enough that we can actually run in production. Then it's a question of even getting access to production or even UAT. Sometimes that's a bit of a challenge. But little by little, you can move in this direction of getting to the point where you can start to do all this funky polynomial stuff.
So I think this is a very nice answer to Gideon's question, that until we're able to take this stuff and make it simple, and that goes to just about every interface we work with, whether we're users or programmers or analysts or managers, if we can't have this stuff in a simple form, then all of the super duper functionality does us no good at all. So a lot of our work in Xscale Alliance is trying to boil the complex down to the simple so that we can take advantage of it. We've got a bunch of neat results in what we've done so far, but this is still stuff that we've got on our plate as a problem to solve. So don't look at this as, oh, now we've got a solution for you to apply. That's not what this talks about.
Perfect. Then we shall talk again next Friday, I hope.
Yes, I have an idea about what we might do, Stefan.
Perfect.
What would you think about having a session on chapters and councils and treaties?
That sounds good to me.
Yeah, a little bit of Haudenosaunee goes a long way.
Yeah, I think the Spotify model, in air quotes, got an uptick recently due to the IPO. Maybe we should talk about that.
That sounds good, and we can talk about Apple DRIs with that as well. Maybe a bit of leadership as a service.
Yeah, that would be nice. Okay, awesome.
Fantastic.
John, thanks a lot for being with us. It's always great talking to you, and talk to you next Friday at the same time. We communicate the URL in advance.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Likewise. Bye-bye.
I will see both of you guys at the Xscale Stewards Council, and Gideon and co. I'm hoping you'll be at the next coaches catch-up. Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.